Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be going through every single book that I read in the month of August. So August was on the surface, like a good reading month for me. I had a few 5-star reads and I also read like 15 books, which is pretty good. But for some reason, I just wasn't very inspired by my reading in August, even though I have found a couple of books that were absolutely amazing. It just felt like more of a struggle than usual. And I do think that's because I was focusing on a lot of books that had very high page counts. I was reading a lot of books that had well over 1,000 pages. So that definitely does feel like you're really working quite hard for something. And I also think I was focusing like a little bit on too much on things I should be reading rather than focusing on just reading, picking up things that I think would be fun in the moment, and I was like sticking too much to my list. So I'm gonna tweak things a little bit next month, but I still have so many good books here to show you and some books that I've had on my TBR for so long, so I'm really excited to finally talk about them and finally have an opinion and tell you what it is. And this month I'm just gonna go in like reverse chronological order of the books that I read. So I will start by talking about the most recent books that I finished and then go back to the ones that I have finished at the beginning of the month. So if we're talking about most recently finished, I finished this book this morning. So on the very last day of August, I finished The Glass Castle. This is one of the books I was just talking about. This one has been on my TBR so long, and it's actually made it onto my 24 priority reads for the year of 2024. And even within that list, it's been sitting there languishing around and I haven't got around to reading it. And then I read it, I picked this up yesterday and I finished it this morning. I was completely hooked by this book. I cannot believe that it took me so long to pick it up. And I knew I would like it. There was loads of people in the comments of my previous videos where I've mentioned this book saying, this book is incredible, you're gonna love it. But for some reason, I just wasn't picking it up. And then I did, and I read it in like less than a day. It was really incredible. So this is actually a memoir. And that might have been one of the reasons why I found it harder to pick up, because I've just not been in a non-fiction mood lately. But oh my God, was this book gripping. So this story is all about Jeannette and her siblings as they are growing up with these parents that are extremely chaotic and irresponsible. Her father has plans to build this glass castle, which is going to be their family home, and he's got these very grand plans, but he is often too drunk and irresponsible to actually put any of them into action. Mother has also chosen to be an artist and give up her teaching career. And so a lot of this book is just recounting the struggle for survival for Jeannette and her siblings. It's incredibly gripping as a book because you are often just so concerned about what is going to be happening next to these children. Also, I think it does a great job of looking at people as complex and whole people, because although her parents are pretty terrible humans and parents, there is always a redeeming factor that you can see why Jeannette still loves them. Her dad is incredibly intelligent and sees himself as the provider for this family, and her mum, despite all her faults, is always pursuing truth and equality and pushes her children to be their own people. I gave this 5 stars. I think actually it's probably a 4.5 that I'm rounding up to 5. I think that the only thing for me that would make it even more hard-hitting for me is if there was slightly more of a reflective tone with Jeannette's writing. I think that I would love some commentary or some more, I don't know, emotional reflection as Jeannette as an adult is looking back on her childhood, because although it's incredibly gripping and you can see through the lens of her growing up, I think it's lacking slightly a personal touch to these reflections. But again, I can see why, in terms of the traumatic way in which she's grown up, that it would have that slightly maybe more impersonal feel. Overall, highly recommend. Such an amazing book, and I think it won't take you long to read it all. Really recommend this one. So the next book I want to talk about is going to be pretty hard to talk about because it's number 13 in a series. But I finally read the next book in the Wheel of Time, and I'm smiling because it's the first book in the Wheel of Time series that I have given 5 out of 5 stars. I loved this book. I read it the fastest I've ever read a Wheel of Time book, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, the Wheel of Time is a classic fantasy series, and it is 14 books long. And each book is like well over 1,000 pages. It's a very intense series. I've been reading it for the last couple of years, and I have had real ups and downs with this series. I really liked it at the beginning, and then as is common with this series in particular, a lot of people have a big slump in the middle, and is actually known as the slog for a few books. But now we are fully out of it. We are wrapping up at the end of this series. The last 3 books are actually written by Brandon Sanderson, who took over after the untimely death of Robert Jordan and finished off the series. So number 13 was the second of the Brandon Sanderson books, and I can see that he's actually slightly moving away from trying to copy Robert Jordan's style as he did a bit more in the previous one, in the book number 12. But I do honestly think it was a bit of a breath of fresh air. Brandon Sanderson is a much more fast-paced writer, and so the plot and everything that we have coming together is just so much better. Plot, all the threads, all the characters, everything is there, and then also with Brandon Sanderson's style being a little bit more choppy and a little bit faster, it just makes for, I think, what's going to be an absolutely explosive end to the series. If you are interested in the Wheel of Time, I've been thinking about vlogging my experience of the last book, of reading the last book. I don't know how much interest there's going to be in that, but I have been thinking about it just because it's the accumulation of like so much for this very last book. But if no one cares, then I'll just read it on my own and I won't vlog it. Next up, we have a book that I unfortunately did DNF, but I do think I might go back to it. But I got to about 50% and then I just decided it was just gonna maybe put me into a slump, and that book is A Dark and Drowning Tide. This book is actually not out yet, and it comes out on, I think, the 17th of September. I was really excited to read this book, and I'm not entirely sure why it didn't work for me, which is why I think I will go back to this. This has all the ingredients that I would like. This is a sapphic fantasy story, and it is very lush in its world building, and the main character is a folklorist who collects stories, basically. It's an enemies to lovers, it's grumpy sunshine, but kind of not grumpy sunshine because they're both like pretty grumpy in their own way. Basically, they are going on this expedition with all of these other people as well to find kind of this magical spring that is the source of all magic. Like I said though, I did like a lot of aspects of this book, even though I only got to 50% before putting it down. I think I'll wait to see other reviews and see if other people are raving about it or not, to see if I pick it up, because for me it just felt like a little bit difficult to get into, because I think a lot of the setup, it was very heavy on the world building, and also the way that the 2 characters were painted at the beginning was a little bit caricature-ish, even though I was kind of enjoying it. It's hard to describe. But this one I've DNF for now, but I probably will go back to it at some point when I've got a bit more brain space. So the next little portion of this video is actually sponsored by the author of this book, which is Red Scarf, that I recently picked up. So Red Scarf is by an indie author, and this is a self-published book. So Red Scarf by Alex Monroe is a historical romance book, but I would also say it's a historical thriller. And Red Scarf is a story within a story. It's about a man who is going into a bookshop one day and finds this manuscript, and then you dive into the story of the manuscript, which is basically all about a man called Alex, who is an antiquarian who buys and sells rare books for a living. He then meets a very intriguing man who invites him up to his huge house in Edinburgh, and he is contracted there to catalogue this man's library. And when he gets there, he strikes up a romance with one of the servants in the house, and as he starts to spend more time in this house, he is discovering maybe some not so good things about the professor who's asked him to come and work there. So while this book is actually set in Edinburgh, it actually follows quite closely Jack the Ripper, and a lot of the mystery is actually focusing on the murders going on in London. If you're interested in Jack the Ripper as a historical time, this is actually book 1 in a series, and the second book I believe is coming out in December this year. Next up, we have the first book that I picked out of my TBR jar, which if you haven't seen, I made a new TBR jar for my TBR, and I picked out a book from it, and then I did end up reading it, which is good, and it was this one, Memoirs of a Teenage Amnesiac. This book was just okay. This is a young adult book about a girl who gets into an accident and basically forgets the last 4 years of her life. So she forgets like all of her like puberty years. She finds herself in a relationship with a guy that she's not sure she actually likes, and she's just very confused about how she's ended up where she is. I liked that as a concept, and there was nothing really wrong with this book. Just to me, it just felt like it reminded me of young adult books that I've read when I was younger, because this is kind of an older book, I think. Like, I would have read, when was this published? Yeah, because this was first published in 2007, which would be exactly like the era that I would have been reading stuff like this. So in that way, it was kind of a fun and nostalgic read, but I did just feel like it lacked a little bit of heart for me. So it left me feeling just like very in the middle. This was like a 2.25 stars for me. So not a win for Gabrielle Zevin. Next up, we have a book that I was reading for my Reading Around the World reading challenge, and that is Pink Slime by Fernanda Trias. This has undoubtedly my favorite cover of the year. Like, this is just like, I'm all about it, and I was just obsessed by the first moment I saw it, and I think that got me a little bit too excited because my expectations were very high. This is a dystopian book, and I also love dystopian, and it wasn't bad in any way. It just wasn't, it didn't end up being for me, and I gave it about 3 stars, but I was hoping this was going to be a 5. So in this book, you're following a woman as she's living in this port town that's been taken over by an ecological crisis. There is this horrifying red wind that sweeps through the town and can basically infect people, make them extremely ill, and like their skin starts falling off. And you're following her as she tries to take care of this young boy. And for most of the book, I was really engaged because it's very mysterious and it's very dark and it is really well written. Just for me, I felt like the main character herself, I felt too disconnected from, and she was too much of a mystery to me. It's kind of one of those books where bad things are happening to the main character, but only due to their own inaction. Like, I don't mind when bad things are happening to a character in a book. Like, that's normal, and that is what like happens in books. But when it's due to just someone making no decision ever, it kind of starts grating on me. When they just like live a sad life because they're not doing anything. That kind of just started to grate on me in the end, and I just felt like I couldn't care by the end because I didn't know her. So I did like the setting, I liked the darkness, I liked the mystery, and I actually liked how it was written. I just couldn't give this more than a 3 because of how I felt disconnected from it emotionally. So that is Pink Slime, although like best cover of the year for me. Next up, I read another book that was on my 24 books to read in 2024 list, and I absolutely loved this one, so I was really, really pleased. And that book was Red Sister. This is by Mark Lawrence, and it's the start of, I think, a 3-book series. This book is gripping, it's intense, it is so good, and I can't wait to finish this series. Basically, in this book, you are following Nonna, and when she is 8 years old, she is accused of murder, but before she can be hung for this crime, she is stolen away by the nuns of Sweet Mercy. They raise her with a second chance to become a Red Sister, because basically at this convent, these young girls are raised to be merciless killers. I loved everything about this first book. I thought it was incredible. The world building is so interesting. It's basically set on this planet with a dying sun, and basically the only light and warmth that this planet gets is down a corridor because of the reflected light from the moon. The book really focuses on self-discovery. You have morally grey characters, you have this wider mystery going on, you have Nonna herself, who is just such a good character. I absolutely loved her. It also really has this school setting because of this convent and all of these girls who are growing up together. So if you like a kind of like magical school setting, I would also recommend this. But I absolutely loved it, and I'm definitely going to be carrying on with this series. I gave it 4.5 stars out of 5. Next up, I read another Kazuo Ishiguro book, as I am trying to read every single book that he has ever written. So this month I read A Pale View of Hills, and this is actually the first book that Kazuo Ishiguro ever published. This one was very interesting, and it does have his signature style and that very dreamlike quality to it, but it left me feeling a lot more confused than I would have liked. I do like to be able to have figured something out by the end of the book. So basically, this is Kazuo Ishiguro's first book, and it is actually, I think, the only book that is mostly set in Japan. And in this book, you're following Etsuko, who is trying to rebuild her life after the devastation in Nagasaki after the war. And she makes friends with a wealthy woman who has fallen on very hard times. And Etsuko is preparing to give birth to her first child, and as she gets closer to this woman and also to this woman's daughter, the book becomes more and more disturbing. So like I said, I did enjoy this book because of how it's written, but I did feel like by the end a little bit more confused than I wanted to, even though I can interpret how it ended how I like. I'm still not completely satisfied with it. And I do honestly feel like even though a lot of it becomes clearer in the end, there are still like entire scenes that I have no idea what their actual purpose was. So I'd be interested to know if anyone's read this and what their take of it was. I gave this, I think, like 2.5 stars, like maybe up to 3. A beautiful cover, and I love it with all the rest of my Kazuo Ishiguro collection, but not my favourite of his. Next up, I read a book that I wasn't planning on reading, but it just came in at my library and I thought I would give it a go because I've heard so much about it. And that book is Kushiel's Dart. This book is, if you've ever heard of it, like you might have heard interesting things about this book because it is really highly recommended for fans of like intense political fantasy, which I am, but also it kind of has its own reputation because a lot of this book is set in a world where sex is a major plot device and a huge focus of the whole story is based around sex, but also in particular like BDSM style sex. So I do find this book quite difficult to talk about because it is not in any way like a romantasy or a romantic fantasy, but there is a romance in this book, and also a lot of this book has explicit sex scenes. So to me it feels incredibly hard to categorize because I'm not sure who to recommend it to. Basically in this book you are following a young girl who is called Phaedra, and she was born with a scarlet mark in one of her eyes, which means she's been marked out by Kushiel, which means that she's been chosen by Kushiel, one of the gods, to always experience pain and pleasure as one. She is then trained as a spy and also a courtesan, and she spends her life as an indentured servant to a noble house and is basically used to kind of uncover plots and treachery. Obviously this gets her into a lot of trouble as well, and she is often at risk. And this book is all about like power and desire, courtly intrigue with a lot of different complicated characters. And I love political and like courtly intrigue and drama. This was at times so complicated that it was very difficult to follow. It's a very long book as well. It's over 1,000 pages, and the world building is incredibly intense and detailed, which makes it actually pretty hard to follow. I ended up rating this a 3.5 stars because I could see like the brilliance of a lot of the plotting that was going on, and also the writing is often very lush as well. A few things about the writing style irritated me. I didn't like a lot of the repetition as well, and also at times there was actually too many threads to follow. I would say don't go into this book if you are squeamish or if you don't like reading about explicit sex scenes. Like, you will definitely not like it, and you will also definitely not like it if you find courtly intrigue and treachery and plots to be not interesting, because that is a lot of what this book is about. But if you find that you do like that intersection, then this could definitely be one of your favorite books. So it's very difficult for me to talk about and to recommend, but such a unique book, one of the most unique books that I've read all year. Next up, we have the book that we read for the Reading Around the World book club. There's always a link in the description if you want to join the Reading Around the World book club. For the month of September, we're reading from Ecuador, and we are reading The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, so that'll be very fun for September. But for this month, for August, we read for Costa Rica, and we read Where There Was Fire. This is a family drama story, and it is focused in Costa Rica around this banana plantation. Basically, there was this horrific fire that happened in 1968, and this family is kind of caught up in the center of it. And so there is dual timelines of the present timeline and then going back, and you're trying to figure out what happened to this family on that fateful day that had effects for like years and years and decades to come. I enjoyed this book at the beginning, but in the end, I didn't really do much for me. I think because a lot of the characters are very morally grey, and especially one character in particular, I think I was supposed to feel a lot more sympathetic to than I actually did. And again, it kind of has that trope of people making their own misery, you know, when they could easily fix things in their life and they decide not to for reasons of pure stubbornness, which is just something that does grate on me because I read that in a lot of books. I really liked a few of the characters though, especially the kind of more comedic relief characters that were in this, and a lot of the mystery and how that evolved throughout the story I was engaged with. It just felt a little bit anticlimactic by the end. If you want to know more of my thoughts and also other people's thoughts, we have been updating them in Fable, which is where we do the book club, so that link is in the description, and that is Where There Was Fire. So I rated this in the end like 2.5 stars, I think. Next up, we have another book that I don't think I was planning on reading, but also just came into my library at a random time. So I listened to this actually as an audiobook, but that book is The Sword Catcher. It always confuses me because her name is so much larger than the actual name of the book. The book is called Sword Catcher, and this is by Cassandra Clare. And this is actually the first book by Cassandra Clare that is not set in the Shadowhunters world. So I was really interested in this because I've read a few of Cassandra Clare's books before, and I have either loved them or just been very much not impressed with them. And this one I felt kind of in the middle. I ended up rating it 3.5 stars, so I did enjoy it, and it is a big old chunky book. I do think that the world building was really good and I enjoyed a lot of the characters. It's just, for me, the plotting was very, very, very slow for it being this much of a book. And I think that a lot of the plotting was kind of setting up for a second book or a third book, and it should have been brought forward and we should have had more action going on in this story. But one thing I really did appreciate in this, and I do think in general Cassandra Clare does very well, is the romance subplots. I do enjoy that she does do slow burn properly. Like, there is a lot of angst and people don't get together immediately and they don't realise that they love each other immediately. To me, it's a properly done slow burn where you kind of can see it evolving very slowly throughout the course of the book, and I do really appreciate that. I think I will carry on with this series and read the second book. Just realised I didn't tell you at all what this book is about. Basically, this is set in a kind of merchant city, and you're following mainly two different characters who have very different lives. One of the characters is known as a sword catcher. He was plucked from an orphanage as a child because he looked very similar to the current prince, and he's grown up with the prince, and then anytime the prince is at risk of kind of any assassination attempt, he takes the prince's place, and they have a kind of medallion that can make him look like the prince, and basically he just steps in. And then you also have Lynn, who is a Ashkari kind of doctor, and the Ashkari in this city are relegated as like second-class citizens, and she is doing whatever she can to heal her best friend who is dying of kind of an unknown illness. And throughout different plots, their lives intersect. I'm not sure that I'll buy these as big old hardbacks. I'm actually not sure where I got this book from because I don't think I paid full price for this. Just checking out the oh, that's pretty, isn't it? I love the gold foiling. So yeah, this was a 3.5 star book for me. I'd be interested if anyone else has read it, what they thought as well, because they are the only people who can still wield magic. Next up, I read Hell Followed With Us, and this book I really was surprised by and really enjoyed. This is a young adult horror dystopian thriller. It's a very dark book, and I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed this. I thought it was so unique. Basically, in this book, you are following a 16-year-old trans boy called Benji, and he is on the run from the extreme religious cult that has raised him. And basically, this religious cult actually brought about Armageddon, and the whole world is like decimated. There is not that many people still alive, and it's like a full-on dystopian world. Benji is a very important person to this cult, and he is then on the run, and when he thinks that all hope is lost, he basically gets taken in by this group of teenagers who have been surviving in this LGBTQ plus center where they all live together and try and fight back in any way they can. Benji is holding this big secret. There's also a romantic subplot going on with one of the other characters. This was really dark. It was really gory, very twisted. It has found family and like self-discovery as a theme, and it really does not shy away from body horror. And yeah, I was just really pleasantly surprised by this book, so I rated it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have a tiny little Clare Keegan book. So this is So Late in the Day, which I feel like I've already talked about reading for some reason. I'm not sure. Like, I definitely did read it this month, so I don't know why I feel like I've talked about this a lot. Maybe just when I was doing my TBR planning. But basically, this is a tiny little book, and basically it's about this man who is finishing work for the evening and going home and fixing himself dinner and watching TV, and he's just thinking about a previous relationship that he's had with a woman. And because it is so short and so tiny, I won't kind of spoil what goes on. It's a very sad, reflective story all about masculinity and relationships and societal expectations, and it's also quite specifically about like Irish men and the societal expectations of relationships. I liked this a lot. I rated it 4 stars. I think that I couldn't rate it any higher because there just not enough there for me, but I did enjoy it. So if you like Clare Keegan, you'll definitely enjoy this, but it's not my favourite of hers. Next up, I read a really highly anticipated book for me, and that is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. This book I enjoyed a lot, but I was hoping it was going to become a new favourite of mine, and it fell, I'd say, quite far short from that. This is a historical fantasy, and it also does have a romantic subplot as well, which I very much enjoyed the romantic subplot of this story. Basically, in this story, you are following Louisa, who is able to do very small magics, and she works as a maid in this kind of crumbling house underneath a very exacting and kind of miserable mistress. And then one day she gets caught, but instead of being fired or given over to the Spanish Inquisition for her use of magic, her mistress kind of takes this as an opportunity to try and change their fates, and she forces Louisa to do little shows for other nobles, but this catches the attention of some very important and dangerous people, and Louisa basically gets taken into this entire plot that is at once like her big opportunity to lead a different life, but also potentially going to be her downfall. My favourite thing about this story was probably the romance that was blossoming. I really enjoyed Louisa as a person as well. She is quite a difficult character, and also like an incredibly ambitious person who then knows that her ambition is going to get her in trouble, but literally cannot help herself from trying to grasp for more, and I really appreciate that as a trait within characters. I do think it took us a while to get to the point of like the main thrust of the plot of this story, and it then felt wrapped up quite quickly, and I was quite sad with how a few of the plot threads ended up. But overall, really fun, very enjoyable book, and I gave it 4 stars. The final book that I want to talk to you about, I've already done an entire vlog about reading, and that book is War and Peace. Like I said, I did an entire reading vlog about this book, which I will tag somewhere on the screen, so if you want to see very, very detailed thoughts about how I was feeling about this book, then you can go and watch that vlog. But suffice to say, I rated this 5 stars. It was a journey. It changed me, and I think that one day I will reread it. It has stayed with me this entire month, and I'm so proud of myself for reading it, but I'm also just very grateful to myself that I pushed through and read it, because it is one of those books that does like, it's very difficult to describe unless you've read it. But very briefly, if you are not aware of War and Peace, this is set around the time of Napoleon's invasion into Russia, and basically the different military campaigns that are going on, and also following a few different societies that are happening in Russia at the same time. This was a challenging read, but I felt so connected to a lot of these main characters by the end, and it made me cry, and yeah, I have very complicated feelings about this book, so I do encourage you to go and watch that vlog, which will be somewhere on the screen. But yes, War and Peace is definitely a 5 out of 5 stars from me. I will quickly mention the 2 that I'm currently in the middle of. I'm also reading Bitter Blue, which is a young adult fantasy series that starts with Graceling. I will tell you more about this next month. And then also I'm currently in the middle of The Name of the Rose. That is gonna see me off, I think. This book has got like just passages of untranslated Latin in it, which is gonna be very interesting to read. So those are the 2 that I'm currently in the middle of. So I think those are all the books that I've been reading. Well, these are the physical ones that I've been reading in the month of August. It's been such a mixed bag, but I'm like looking at them all, I'm very proud of what I did read, and I found a few potential new favorites of the year, so I don't know why I was being so negative. Please let me know if you've read any of these books or any of the ones that I've spoken about. But yeah, these are all the books that I have read this month. I'm pretty proud of them. They are incredibly heavy. I managed to get through quite a few that are very, very long, but please let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you want to now after I've recommended them. And please remember to like and subscribe, and go and watch all of my other videos, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!